Welcome to the Modern Athenas podcast with Sonia and Debbie, where we discuss how regular women became Athenas in their own time by working hard, persevering through the challenges in their lives, and contributing to a better world. This is podcast 15. In this podcast, we will be discussing the book, The Rules Do Not Apply by Ariel Levy. You can use the link on our website at modernathenas.com to order the book after the podcast. Not every modern Athena is a woman who has become a well-known warrior. Sometimes modern Athenas can be found quietly persevering through life's never-ending twists and turns, making it through one day and another until they've passed through darkness, light, and time. In The Rules Do Not Apply, Ariel begins the book talking about the loss of her spouse, her child, her home, and the life that she was building for herself. She then turns back in time, taking us through her journey of building her writing career, finding love, owning a home, and becoming pregnant. She also takes us through the darkness of her partner's alcoholism, her miscarriage, and the sense that she may never find happiness. As we discuss Ariel's rocky road, we hope our listeners find solace in her words. No one has everything in life. After introducing readers to the heartbreak that foreshadows the rest of the book, Ariel discusses writing. Quote, I started keeping a diary in the 3rd grade, and, in solidarity with Anne Frank, I named it and personified it and made it my confidant. The point that prompted me to keep a diary in the first place. I don't have a friend, Frank told Kitty, her journal. Writing is communicating with an unknown intimate who is always available, the way the faithful can turn to God. My lined notebooks were the only place I could say as much as I wanted, whenever I wanted. To this day, I feel comforted and relieved of loneliness, no matter how foreign my surroundings, if I have a pad and a pen. End quote. And, I think that she makes this sort of analogy to how the faithful turn to God and, she turns to her notebooks. But I think everybody has that sort of space or hobby or, place where they're able to go to kind of express themselves other than, their normal sort of course of the day or family.
For me, a lot of times that actually has been music. And even though I don't play oboe as much as I did for a long time, that was my own kind of personal space and personal time each and every day. But sometimes it would get tied up in kind of the anxiety of finding a job as well. But I did relate to this writing aspect more so in high school and college when I would write poetry and keep a journal. But somehow that's kind of fallen away in the last 10 years. And it seems to be a real point of reflection and discovery for her, which is something important to find in each day.
And I also find that, I used to journal more frequently, but as time has passed, either I'm finding other outlets for that sort of energy or that self-reflection. And then there's also that time angle, right? Like instead of writing in a journal, I want to spend time doing something else. So I think, we kind of change as we grow through life and kind of take a different path. Ariel then takes us back to when she was 22 and working for New York Magazine. Back when she was young and carefree, quote, we decided not to wait for someone at the office to give us permission to do what we really wanted, end quote. And so began her journalism career. Ariel independently researched and wrote her first piece, which was about an unconventional kind of female life, focusing on what it meant to be a woman, what the rules were, and what one's options and encumbrances were. Quote, writing satisfied the edict my mother had issued many times throughout my life. You have to make your own living. You never want to be dependent on a man, end quote. And so really early on, as Ariel is sort of struggling to get her feet under her and start her journalism career, she has this sort of inner confidence that was built by her mom. And we'll talk more about her mother later, but, this ability to step out into the unknown and yet feel confident in herself.
I was thinking about when I was 22, which was first semester of grad school, and I felt like I had maybe another way to describe it as boldness in me, but I also had a lot of maturing to do. So it's kind of an interesting combination about how long lasting your decisions are at that point in your life. But for me, I could actually really relate to the way she described life at 22.
Yeah, and I was actually 22 when I started on my master's degree, and that those 22, 23 years for me were very they were my way of growing up. And before that, I kind of sort of struggled through and kind of tripped on myself. But those were definitely the years where I learned how to adult and to do all of the things that, you need to do as an adult and how to stop working so much from an emotional place or almost a reckless place and learning to sort of find that balance in your life. Ariel describes her passion this way. I wanted to feel the limitless Mongolian steppes spread out in front of me. I wanted to know what it smells like in the morning in Rajasthan. Why? I want to do it because I want to do it, Amelia Earhart once wrote in a letter to her husband. Women must try things men have tried. I would not kick the door off its hinges. I would not choose the muffling comforts of home. I would be an explorer, not the mummy. End quote. Then, as a journalist, Ariel has since traveled the globe for stories, going from Mongolia to South Africa to Paris. First, she worked for the New York Magazine, where she rose from an assistant to a contributing editor, and then she later joined the New Yorker as a staff writer. So Ariel, very early on in her career, sort of has this adventurous streak and wants to go way out to find the stories to write on.
And she has this kind of free spirit about her, and because she hasn't yet met her future spouse, I feel like that's a time in your life where you do have a lot of that kind of you're a bit more unattached. And I had some experiences in grad school where I was able to go overseas and play in an orchestra in Lucerne, Switzerland for 3 weeks. And then I went to New York and played in Carnegie Hall for a week. And those are such like exciting times, and I'm very thankful for them. And then life's adventures kind of take different shapes as you grow older and go beyond school and enter the professional life. But I think that those are really important experiences.
No, I agree. And I think that any time in life when you can sort of take and sort of have that an experience of any kind, whether it's traveling or trying something new or, some kind of adventure, those are sort of the moments later on that you look back on and really enjoy. Ariel discusses growing up as an only child in Westchester, New York. She describes what would be familiar to many of our listeners, playing with neighborhood friends, hanging out with her parents, and learning about life. She also talks about how her mother was a strong woman who was always telling her to make her own way and not to be beholden to a man. When Ariel left the house for college, she says her mother had, quote, produced a daughter who was an adequate cook and a valiant eater, and who wasn't dependent on a man, end quote. For many of us, our grandparents or parents' kitchen were a central part of our childhood. Ariel describes her mother's management of the kitchen and the family meals, quote, there was a corresponding orbit of moods this obligatory food preparation induced in my mother. No-nonsense competence, spunky pride, and seething resentment. From my mother, I learned that you can make your family feel a wonderful sense of protected indulgence by cooking them something with jolly care. I also learned that you can launch a powerful campaign of resistance by mincing garlic like a martyr. My mother's festive cookery was really something. Her repertoire magically expanded on special occasions. End quote. And as I was reading this discussion that Ariel's having about, sort of how her home revolved around the kitchen for different Sundays or whatever, different days of the week, holidays. Growing up as a child, my grandmother was really sort of that centerpiece for our extended family, and we always gathered for Christmas Eve together and would make a huge meal and sort of enjoy it. And that meal was definitely the centerpiece of, I think, of most people's Christmas season.
My grandmother, my dad's mom, she was sounds very similar, and it was a lot of great memories around her dinner table. And but I almost never saw her sitting down at the dinner table because she was always worried that someone needed a second helping or a third helping or dessert. And it was funny.
My grandma was the exact same way. It was like she had a place at the table, but she was sitting in it for maybe 5 minutes out of the whole meal because she kept getting up to get more stuff and to make sure everybody was, satiated.
Yeah, it was literally like you'd finish maybe 2 bites off your plate at all, and then she's like, "Oh, do you need more?" She wanted, but I think that always came from a place of that was how she showed her love, and she just wanted to make sure everybody had what they needed, and so those are some very special times, and I'm thankful that I had a lot of those meals. And another thing that my parents had us have breakfast together and dinner together just about every day of the week growing up. And I don't know if that's an unusual thing, but it became very, very routine. And sometimes my mom would make like a special breakfast, even on a weekday, French toast, pancakes, something. And I remember I was thinking about that in the last couple years, because now Ethan's of the age where I like to do that for him every once in a while. And so it's a very warm and comforting feeling to be able to do that occasionally, like those special occasion meals.
Yeah, and in the same way, my grandma also definitely showed her love through the kitchen, and it was with her, nobody ever went hungry. She always wanted to cook this like spectacular meal when anybody came over. And, if it definitely if it was a special occasion, but the warmth of the home that was made from her cooking. And, now that she's passed, we got recipes of things that she made, but honestly, it'll never be the same way that she made them just because of the amount of love and attention and time that she would put into everything. Eventually, Ariel's mother and father split up, divorcing while Ariel was in college. We pick up her story after college when Ariel was visiting a friend's apartment in New York City. Ariel opened up the friend's fifth floor window to let the smoky air out of the living room, only to watch the air conditioning unit that was in the window fall 5 stories onto the ground below. Petrified that she could have killed someone, which she couldn't since the window wasn't over a walkway, she began to feel her mortality for the first time. Then she gets a phone call from her father saying he has cancer, that it was too far along for surgery, and that the prognosis was not good. Quote, "It was oddly exhilarating, not the prospect of my father dying, but the way things could change, just like that. Had that window faced the street, I could have killed somebody with that air conditioner, and then that would have been the truth from then on, forever. Life, so plotting and seemingly circumscribed, was label, fragile." End quote. Later, Ariel finds out that in fact her father was not dying, but still she is led on the emotional roller coaster so many experience with faced with the death of a loved one. End quote. And so, Ariel talking about the fragility of life. I've been thinking in my own life, when you have relatives pass away and multiple close relatives pass away, it really makes you sort of feel that, life is always going to end at some point, and carpe diem, I guess, but, and to live life and enjoy it. And yeah, feel your mortality, but don't sort of fester in it.
I feel like when those losses happen, it's kind of shakes you out of your everyday, and also it can be a landmark in a way to kind of reflect upon what is important to you. And there was actually an incident early on about in 2006. Jordan and I got engaged, and then later that week he was in a car accident. He and his brother were in a head-on collision with another vehicle, and he ended up in the ICU. And that was definitely shaking me out of my everyday. I will never forget that day. But that was very pivotal and like you said, made me feel very appreciative for the time that I do have with him.
Yeah, and I think death always makes me feel mortal in a way. I mean, I don't like to sort of stay in that kind of dark space about death. And when you have multiple people in your family pass away, it starts to become almost this numbing experience. And everybody stops or can't find things to say to each other, right? Because every funeral happens and, you're all just there staring at each other and thinking, wow, life is just unpredictable. And that's something I've definitely walked away with and know it's your time can come at any time. And so instead of, waiting for the future to do things, do them in the now. There's no reason to not live life to its fullest. And as you were saying, you get wrapped up in that daily grind and you forget to sort of step away from that and think to yourself, what kind of adventure do I want, or, what kind of life do I want to build for myself?
Well, and you were talking about your grandmother and kind of the legacy she had of these meals and how it won't quite be the same to try to recreate those. But I think I've thought a lot about that word legacy in the last 2 years. I lost both my grandmas 2 years ago. And what was their legacy? And how can I also make sure that doesn't ever die as well? And so that's been something I've thought a lot about. And they were very generous. They were they loved their family and being surrounded by their family. And it was very important that the family stay connected. So that's the legacy they've left behind that I feel I need to keep going.
Yeah, my grandma was the same way, like almost exactly the same way. And it's been hard since she passed. And I've also had two of her children, my mom's siblings, have passed, and my mom's sister-in-law also passed. And so it's this, as these people sort of almost disappear from the family tree and the family starts shrinking. It's hard for everybody to keep in contact because my grandma was really the force that kept everybody together. She had this like extended force field almost where it was like everybody that was inside the force field just couldn't get out, right? She had kind of everybody all there at every holiday and just all together. And then, that force field goes away and it's people start to scatter a little bit, and it's hard to keep in communication because you no longer have that sort of central person or almost purpose to get together. Like many women, Ariel is finding her way in adult relationships in the early part of the book. She eventually meets a woman named Lucy, who, at the time they met, has a partner, a house, and a job in California. Eventually, however, Ariel and Lucy fall in love and they get married. Quote, getting married to a woman seemed like an act of solidarity with a movement that I was not really entitled to be a part of. Oh, give me a break, said Lucy, a real lesbian with impeccable credentials and decades of experience in the field. The whole point is that everybody gets to marry the person they love. End quote. Lucy gave up her job in California and moved east to be with Ariel. They settled down on Shelter Island, which is at the eastern end of Long Island in Suffolk County, New York. Ariel talked about how both her mother and father were avid gardeners and how, as new homeowners, she and Lucy planted their own garden, complete with flowers, raised beds of tomatoes, and wisteria. As the years passed, the wisteria vines began to swallow up the tacky railing in the home's backyard, and the place became a home. After moving to Shelter Island, Lucy invested the profits of her California home sale into a new business installing solar panels. Meanwhile, Ariel continued to write articles and further her journalism career. So you have Ariel, kind of this wanderlust, adventurous spirit, starting to settle down by finding a partner and love and buying a house and really starting to transition her life into that next phase of adulthood.
I thought the same exact word, transition, and it's kind of from this, like, for especially for Ariel, this kind of dreamer and kind of bold, impulsive decision maker, to now finding a way to live out life now and maybe making some longer lasting decisions. And I felt that transition from coming out of grad school and into marriage. It's something that you have to navigate kind of almost without a pathway in front of you. You kind of just take each day by it, and you have to kind of figure out that path by yourself, in a sense, and what's going to work best for you and your situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because college prepares us for careers, right? But what it doesn't prepare us for is how to learn how to adult almost. Like, you don't necessarily learn in college on how to buy a house or how to get along with your spouse partner or, what happens when you have children or, all of these sort of challenges that everybody faces in adulthood. Like you were saying, it's just the path is not made for you yet, and you kind of have to find your way sometimes through these like brambles or jungles of bushes. But it's difficult, it's hard, and people stumble and make mistakes, and there's no one way to do it. And Ariel starts to talk about her love of Lucy and their relationship as it starts to build. But as we'll talk about in a few minutes, as that relationship changes, both she and Lucy navigate it very differently and react to it very differently. Quote, from the minute the dragon of our fertility came on the scene, we learned to chain it up and forget about it. Fertility meant nothing to us in our 20s. It was something to be secured in the dungeon and left there to molder. In our early 30s, we remembered it existing and wondered if we should check on it. And then, abruptly, horrifyingly, it became urgent. Somebody find that dragon. It was time to rouse it and get it ready for action. But the beast had not grown stronger during the decades of hibernation. By the time we tried to wake it, the dragon was weakened, wizened, old. With modern science, it could be resurrected, though, made fire-breathing once more. We were playing with a power much greater than even sexuality, nature herself. End quote. So the book starts to talk a little bit about how Ariel is sort of feeling like she's getting older here, and, her biological clock is beginning to tick, and what she's going to do about that. And I think that a lot of women, I know I have really faced that dilemma, because either you're not in a space to have a child, or you haven't, if you want a partner or spouse to have a child with, you haven't necessarily found that person yet, and almost that like the years are starting to run out, which makes you either panic or start to think, is having a child the right thing for me? Am I just destined not to have a child? And all these kinds of questions come to the surface, as Ariel's saying, as you move into your early 30s.
And I would say that's another thing they don't teach you in college and they don't prepare you for, is, just navigating life and marriage and life to try to be a parent. And I, I think I had always dreamed of having a family. So when Jordan and I got married, it wasn't, more than a couple years before we wanted to try to start a family. But like I've spoken about before, it took about 4 years until Ethan came, and a couple miscarriages. But uh, becoming a mother is also very different than I had imagined, but it's also even more than I imagined.
Yeah, and I think these days, when our science has advanced so far, it's two different tracks. It's science really helps women who can't get pregnant for a lot of reasons, and science also has started to extend our fertility period, into 40s, end of 40s. So people are having children now at a much sort of broader age band than they were before, and also these stories of women like yourself, Sonia, having or struggling to get pregnant and have a child, it's more open now to talk about those things than it was before. And it's fascinating sort of how our culture has changed around having children. And some of my friends who have had children, you start, they post on Facebook, they post on other social media, and you if you haven't had them, you're hearing your biological clock ticking. But on the other sense, you kind of watch from afar, and it's like that's great for them, and then you wonder if that would be good for you, or whether you just have some other destiny. As Ariel starts to settle down into married life, she thinks about her mother, who had been through some tumultuous times when married and after the divorce. Quote, "But I understand now her dilemma. I wanted what she had wanted, what we all want, everything. We want a mate who feels like a family and a lover who is exotic and surprising. We want to be youthful adventurers and middle-aged mothers. We want intimacy and autonomy, safety and stimulation, reassurance and novelty, coziness and thrills. But we can't have it all." End quote. And we've talked about this before, this inability to sort of have everything at the same time, and that in life, you may have a great relationship with your spouse or partner for a while, and then maybe the focus changes to your career or the focus changes to children, and then it might come back to your spouse or partner. But it's very difficult to have everything sort of perfect all at the same time.
I totally agree. And I think it's a hard lesson to learn. And I think for myself, it's been a long lesson to learn. And I know I still have a lot of learning to go, but um, as we talked about, like with Ariel, as she's transitioning to her professional and married life, she kind of has to make this transition from this dreamer into this person who's living more in the moment. And I would say definitely throughout my 20s, I was wanting it all and trying to be all things to all people. That's another aspect too. I think that it's really hard to balance the two. You certainly can't have it all and try to be everything for everyone. And so now I'm 35, and just now I'm starting to figure out that it's better to kind of un, accept gratitude into your life for the things that you do have, and that that actually is of high value now.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about this before, but social media is like this perfect sort of image of everybody's lives. But really it's like a snapshot of 10 seconds of someone's, day that they've spent 5 hours trying to film the kid or like get the picture set up, and then they take one shot, right? And then they post it, and you're like, oh, what a perfect whatever. And the reality is no one's life is perfect, and everybody is struggling. And no one can have it all at the same time. And people put different emphasis on different things, and when you have children, that's where all your focus and energy goes, and other things will fall by the wayside. But you're right. I mean, being able to accept that gratitude for things that you do have or moments in life, is it almost lets you slow down a little bit and enjoy it a little bit more.
Well, I was thinking maybe another thing about it is that in in the absence of us, none of us being able to have it all, it's what we then do end up with, and how we do end up pursuing things in life, that our lives become different from each other's in a way. And so what that's even a more important reason to kind of embrace the fact that we all choose different paths, we all have different interests, and our lives might not look like each other's, but there's still kind of that common thread that we're all trying to just navigate this day by day.
That's absolutely true. And I think that the more that we can accept that about ourselves, we can accept it about other people. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the darker parts of the book, which Ariel really does a good job sort of explaining her feelings and sort of the events that led them into darkness, and um, a good discussion about whether or not darkness, took hold and never went away. At some point, Ariel begins to have an affair. By this point, she's taken up an apartment in New York City. It is unclear how often Lucy visits the city, other than it appears that she and Ariel live apart at least a few days a week. Lucy usually remains on Shelter Island, consumed with making her business succeed. Ariel, in turn, when she's in New York, works on her journalism career. It is in the city that Ariel reconnects with an old friend, Jim, and has the affair. It started out, as Ariel describes it, as a one-time thing. But then it kept going, night after night, day after day. Quote, "You have an affair to get for yourself what you wish would come from the person you love the most. And then you have broken her heart and she can never give you any of it ever again." End quote. And, I think that hearing Ariel talk about this sort of slippery slope of, getting in contact with Jim again, and then, oh, it's just going to be one night. I'm just going to have a one night affair of the heart, and, then I can be able to move on. But really, at the end of the day, the affair was sort of like a red flag or a signal that her relationship with Lucy was starting to disintegrate.
I was reminded of our discussion about Year by the Sea when we talked about relationships as either completing each other or complementing each other. And she kind of articulates that exactly when she talks about wishing for something that would come from the person you love most. And at the same time, it seems like this was the beginning of kind of irre- uh, damage that could not be repaired after this point.
Yeah, and definitely the way that she talks about it, it's the beginning of this sort of crack between her and Lucy, and the beginnings almost of these like tectonic plates like pulling apart slowly, like day after day. Meanwhile, while Ariel's affair was happening, Lucy was fighting her own demons. She started slipping into alcoholism. Ariel's longtime friend Matt tried to get Ariel to see Lucy's drinking for what it was. Quote, Matt sighed. "I was watching that show Intervention the other night, and the people sound like you, like they're missing a piece of their brains. You have to be that way when you're addicted to something. In order to finish your cigarette, you have to cordon off the knowledge that it's killing you. And if you're addicted, you will. It won't even feel like a choice." End quote. Lucy tells Ariel that she'll stop drinking, but she doesn't stop. Ariel tells herself, quote, "The reason Lucy seems off sometimes is that she's still drinking. You've always known this. The only thing that's mysterious is how you managed to think it was mysterious." End quote. Quote, "It was occurring to Lucy, to both of us, that there were other people, addicts, who looked fine but could not stop themselves from taking things that were warping their lives." End quote. Okay, so now we have the starts of Lucy's addiction to alcohol. And, I know a lot of our listeners have either suffered or have family or friends that have suffered with addiction. And this is sort of where we start to see it turn from "I like alcohol" to "I can't live without the alcohol." And that addiction sort of taking over Lucy's life. And that it starts to spread into every little nook and cranny of her life.
Yeah, like you said, it's kind of with Ariel's affair is kind of this slide into, down this path. And it seemed like addiction, especially in Lucy's case, was this kind of persistent but elusive and kind of deceiving um, entry, part of her life. And it's almost like how Ariel says the only thing that's mysterious is how she managed to think it was mysterious. It's just, I wonder if it was like all of a sudden one day her eyes were opened, Ariel's, to see that Lucy had gone so far down this path, and the same for Lucy too.
Yeah, I think it's hard to see it. So if you live with someone 24/7, I think things like addictions can be hard to see because it doesn't just start one day with alcoholism. It's this sort of slide into alcoholism. if you're there every day, the slide doesn't seem so dramatic because you're not seeing it from afar. You're seeing it just, one morning it's this, one morning it's that. And, it's maybe it's one glass of something at night and then it starts to slide into two and then it slides into three. But it just happens almost of this natural evolution of the addiction that you just aren't even noticing it's happening. And then, as you said, it seems like this moment where Ariel's like, no, this is definitely a problem. This isn't normal. This needs to get fixed. And still, Lucy did not stop drinking, and slowly the alcoholism began to take over her life, slipping away a bit more, day after day. One day, Lucy drove home drunk, beer cans in the back of the car. When Ariel ran out into the driveway to meet her, she promptly sent Lucy to bed, packed up the cats and her own stuff, and made a beeline for the city, not knowing what she was going to do next. Lucy called Ariel as Ariel was driving into the city and said that without Ariel, her life was not worth living and that she was going to end it. Ariel told Lucy to get back into the house, that they would work through it. Lucy promised to call once she went back inside, but she never called. Ariel frantically called a neighbor who couldn't get a hold of Lucy either. Ariel, left with no other option, called 911. The police made it in time. Lucy was transported to the hospital and then admitted to the psychiatric unit for alcoholism. Now, quote, the secret had been revealed, the mystery solved. I didn't need to convince Lucy or myself that this was an urgent problem. She would get help now. Whatever that meant, I had no idea. But things would soon be better, end quote. So we have Lucy's addiction really taking over her life now and leading to this absolutely dramatic moment of the suicidal thoughts that Lucy has, and speaking about the suicidal thoughts to Ariel, and in a way perhaps even acting on them, though the police show up before any of that could have happened.
Yeah, dramatic is an understatement, and this has to be a pivotal moment in their lives, I imagine, because they have to emerge from this somehow and make some decisions as to what the next steps in their lives are going to be.
Yeah, and you wonder, is this the moment that Lucy hits rock bottom? With her drinking. And for most alcoholics, there's going to be a moment that they hit rock bottom, and that may not stop them from being an alcoholic. For some, it will. For some, they'll seek treatment. But there's always that moment in time when most people can identify that we've moved far from just an addiction to something that's a serious addiction. And Lucy being admitted to a psychiatric hospital for alcoholism, I think to Ariel sort of symbolized that rock bottom, and where could she go from here with her relationship? Lucy still didn't stop drinking after that incident. Although she swore to Ariel she hadn't. Eventually, unable to hide her alcoholism anymore, Lucy ended up in rehab. As Ariel packed boxes of Lucy's things to send to her in rehab, she started grieving the loss of their relationship. Quote, how dare she have been drinking all this time when she swore she was sober? I'd been sick with guilt about my affair for 2 years, and all the while she was lying about this? I told her many times, I feel insane, and she never said, you're not crazy, you're right. How had I failed to perceive that Lucy had never stopped drinking? There had been 100 shadows of her alcoholism. Only much later did I see that it never mattered what questions I had asked or how shrewdly I had scrutinized her answer. Addicts lie. End quote. And I thought it was really interesting how Ariel got so mad at Lucy, but yet she had a 2-year affair at the same time. So it's almost like they both had these behaviors that kind of drew them far apart from each other, but neither one could look at themselves and say, I'm contributing to this, or I too have a problem. It was like they just kept looking at the other person and kind of pointing a finger.
Yeah, there's in a way it was kind of like addiction, whether it's maybe Ariel addicted to this kind of affair or Lucy to alcoholism. It was kind of masquerading some way, whether in an effort to deceive and survive. But I think that Ariel's feeling maybe defensive because she knows. I mean, I don't know. Did Lucy realize at this point the affair? And but Ariel then is going to probably become even more defensive about her own choices, especially in light of how impacted she is by Lucy's decisions. I wonder if she was worried that Lucy would become very impacted, obviously, by Ariel's decision had she shared about the affair. at this point in their lives.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think that there's also this defensiveness from both of them, and they hide their sort of sadness and emotions about the relationship disintegrating behind these addictions. And so instead of sort of admitting to each other that their relationship needed work and that their relationship, it wasn't what it had been at the beginning, um, they instead sort of throw themselves into the addiction and kind of try and almost self-medicate through their addiction rather than figuring out either, let's get counseling or let's work on our relationship or let's just split up. And it makes me think of all the people that are out there who their relationship with their partner or spouse, starts to disintegrate, and then they engage in these behaviors to sort of almost like self-soothe or you know, avoid the discussion. In the midst of Lucy's battle with alcoholism and in the wake of Ariel's affair, Lucy and Ariel decided to have a baby. They asked one of Ariel's good friends to be the donor. They wanted the dad involved in the baby's life, even though they would be the primary parents. He agreed, and at 38, Ariel became pregnant with a baby boy. Quote, I felt less and less like a bad person. There was something so good inside of me. I was making something so good out of my very self. How rotten could I be? I started talking to the baby in my head instead of to myself. Even if you're not Robertson Crusoe in a solitary fort, as a human being you walk this world by yourself. But when you're pregnant, you are never alone. End quote. And I just got this feeling that, in the midst of these two addictions that they have and they're pulling apart, they have this idea to have a child, which I don't know, maybe they both perceived that the child would bring them closer together. I think making that kind of a decision when your relationship is already on this like very rocky road is almost in a little way a dangerous decision, because if your relationship just continues to disintegrate, your home will split and the child will end up, it's almost in a way suffering for it.
Yeah, it kind of comes back to that. Is the goal of this new relationship, is it to complete Ariel and Lucy's relationship, or is it to complement it? And it does not feel very complimentary at this point, because especially on the depths of where they both are in these pretty destructive journeys, it feels like a very hard place to be.
Yeah, and I definitely think that they were hoping that it would be complementary and hoping that it would draw them closer together. But, when Ariel's talking about, how bad of a person could I be? It's almost like she's justifying her behavior by saying, well, now I'm pregnant, I have this baby, I'm not walking alone, and, life is going to be different, rather than sort of confronting the issues that led to her behavior in the first place. Ariel's and Lucy's parents were both excited for the birth of the grandson. Quote, my mother was happy in a way I never knew I could make her, and this made me love her with an open-hearted abandon I had not experienced since childhood. It occurred to me that she was the one who had told me I could be the kind of woman who is free to do whatever she chooses. My mother had never once been surprised when I accomplished something. She'd never believed me when I told her I would fail, even when she took me to the airport with my hulking backpack when I was 22 and afraid of Phnom Penh, afraid of Kathmandu, and of course, so was she. She didn't say, you're right, it's too dangerous, let's go home. She said, get on the plane, you'll be fine. End quote. And it made me really think of my mom and how supportive she's been in my life. And I know not all of our listeners have that relationship with their mother, but mine's been just so valued for me, because she's always there to sort of prop me back up and push me forward, and not necessarily sort of hold my hand, but definitely there as sort of that guiding hand.
It shows the power of, having maybe either a mentor, a mother, a sister, an aunt who does kind of empower really and strengthen and support you in decisions. And I know my mom did. She drove me around to oboe lessons and rehearsals and track practice and track meets and anywhere, because I was pursuing a lot of things in high school. But even now as an adult, we'll have conversations every so often about various things that are going on and how to address them. And she tries to comfort in all those situations, even if she doesn't know how to best do it in every situation, because after all, how can any of us know what to do in every situation? But I think, like you said, not holding the hand, but the best thing we can sometimes do for someone is just support them and encourage them on their journey.
No, and I agree. And, she says, my mother had never once been surprised when I accomplished something, but I kind of laughed when I read that because my mom's the same way. And like, I'm so excited sometimes for things I've accomplished. And both my mom and my grandmother just kind of look at me and they're like, of course you did that, and it's like, oh, that's my moment. But, I think that having a mother that just believes in you, or like you said, a mentor, or somebody in your life that you really feel this sort of, when you have the accomplishment, they kind of have it with you. I think that's so valuable. When Ariel was 5 months pregnant, she accepted an assignment in Mongolia. Her doctor told her it was fine to travel, so she got on the plane and took the long ride west through China to Mongolia, arriving in Ulaanbaatar, the capital. Quote, I would teach my child the power of fearlessness. I would tell him, when you were inside of me, I went to see the edge of the earth. End quote. Ariel's trip to Mongolia started out well, but then she started having pain in her abdomen. By the next day, the pain was persistent. She thought maybe it was the baby kicking. By that night, she thought maybe she had dysentery, like she'd had a decade earlier in Cambodia. But the truth was far worse. Her baby was born that night as she crouched on the hotel bathroom floor. She called the South African doctor, Dr. John Gasson, whose name a local expat had given her early in that day. By the time she and her baby reached Dr. Gasson at the local medical clinic, her baby had passed away. Dr. John told her it had been a placental abruption. Ariel was filled with grief and guilt. Maybe, just maybe, if she hadn't have traveled, she would still have her son. She eventually made it home to New York, having already delivered the bad news to Lucy, the baby's father, and their families. In the coming weeks, Ariel would find that there was nothing wrong with her, that the placental abruption had in fact been a completely random event. But while still in Mongolia, she had received an email from the baby's father, quote, Nature is wasteful, he had said. That's why there are so many pine cones on the forest floor. His mother had pointed them out to him once when he was a child and explained that nature starts many more projects than she can ever finish. End quote. So here you have Ariel literally across the world and going through this incredible emotional experience of having her baby born at 5 months and, knowing that the baby probably wouldn't survive yet, not being able to accept that, her baby had passed, and then also really struggling with this idea of guilt. Did she travel too much? Shouldn't she have taken the assignment? And you can't sort of unring that bell. And you can hear the sense of loss and guilt in her voice as she's explaining what happened.
Yeah, and also I was trying to think Mongolia of all places, like she's like halfway across the world when this happened. So there's kind of that just intense separation and probably loneliness, which I think when anyone suffers, very personal loss, sometimes it can feel very isolated and like no one else has that same experience that they could relate to you. And I suffered a couple losses as we've talked about, and I definitely rattled my brain to try to figure out what I could have done differently. And, all the medical tests kind of came back and said there wasn't. And this kind of goes along the lines of there's not that kind of guidebook for life, and no one really talks about some of the things you're gonna encounter. And, in fact, 1 in 5 pregnancies end in miscarriage, and that's kind of similar to what the baby's father was saying about nature starts more projects than she can ever finish. But no one ever really prepares you for that. So this is kind of just another point along Ariel's life where she's, which I think everyone has those points along their lives where they experience these intensely dramatic and tragic things that there's kind of no preparation for.
Yeah, and when those tragic events happen, I think everybody, well, most everybody feels guilt. And it's just this overwhelming sense of what could I have done? What should I have done differently? What didn't I do? And, you start replaying all these events in your mind and just starting to do that sort of backwards look, which doesn't help anything because the events already happened. But yet we all sort of struggle in this like just non-moving little morass of guilt for, and some people for forever, others just for, a longer period of time, trying to kind of bring this rational reconciliation to ourselves. But, it doesn't matter how many medical tests you have to tell you it wasn't your fault. It doesn't matter how many people tell you it wasn't your fault, until you kind of come to grasps with that and, are able to move forward, you're going to be kind of stuck in this moment. Quote, grief is a world that you walk through skinned and unshelled. A person would speak to me unkindly or even ungently on the street or in an elevator, and I would feel myself ripping apart, the membrane of normalcy I'd pulled on to leave the house coming undone. Better to stay inside my snug apartment alone with the cats, where I didn't have to pretend to be intact. End quote. So here you have Ariel feeling just overwhelming grief and this sort of desire to hide away and not engage with people and keep this sort of front or shell around her as she's trying to process this.
Well, and I think for anyone who's in that place of grief too, as the people around them might do kind of what they see as insignificant things or not even be aware how their actions are kind of impacting that person through that grieving process. Like a person would speak unkindly or urgently, and it's like every one of those interactions when you're in that place carries almost more weight than maybe they would if you weren't grieving. And I was also thinking a lot about what comes after grief. And for me, it was actually a lot of resentment and anger towards the people I saw around in my life or in on social media or in on TV and movies who seemed to have what I wanted. And I think that probably is another common thing to feel when you experience some sort of loss, whatever it might be, or disappointment, and then you kind of move through this anger and resentment. And you have to get to the other side. Otherwise, it's like you said, you're going to be looking in that rearview mirror and you're going to be dwelling on what could have been rather than now stepping into your new life.
Yeah, and I think that that time period of grieving is different for everybody. And I don't think it ever ends. I mean, I think you always carry with you just a part of that person or a part of that event, or and it'll arise or sort of come up on your radar at different moments, or maybe it's a smell or a sound or another event that reminds you of that. But it's an ability when you're sort of through the process of being able to sort of compartmentalize that moment that may come up later and not relive your grief completely all over again.
Well, that's a great point, and it's also a good reminder as we're interacting with anybody that they might be at a point of grief or kind of still have some remnants on that day of some loss that happened 2 decades ago. And it's important to me. I was really impacted by the way she talked about how those insignificant negative interactions can really impact someone in that place. And so maybe really think about my interactions with people and how more thoughtful maybe I need to be, thinking that at any point someone could be going through a really hard time.
Ariel continued to grieve. People told her she could try again or persisted in telling her things like, well, next time you won't get on a plane. But in a strange way, Ariel says, I'm comforted by the truth. Death comes for us. You may get 10 minutes on this earth, or you may get 80 years, but nobody gets out alive. Accepting this rule gives me a funny flicker of peace. In an interview Ariel had done some years before with Maureen Dowd, the sole female columnist at the New York Times, she asked Maureen if she ever wanted children. Maureen said, quote, everybody doesn't get everything. Ariel noted, it sounds depressing to me at the time, a statement of defeat. Now admitting it seems like the obvious and essential work of growing up. Everybody doesn't get everything. It's natural and unavoidable as mortality. End quote. And so you sort of have Ariel moving through the grieving process almost to acceptance of this notion of you don't always get what you want, and you don't always get what you want at the time that you want it. And she's almost coming to this sort of conclusion or this point where she's saying, maybe it wasn't meant to be, or, maybe I just have to move forward.
Well, and I think that this phrase, essential work of growing up, kind of for me was a theme for this book. And in a way, it's almost as if she comes a little bit with to peace about all of this and at this point. And Maybe she's realizing that every moment really can have value in its own on its own, and what I wonder what she's now going to see as what she's going to be really grateful for in her life, and what her next steps will be, and how she'll kind of approach each day after these experiences.
Yeah, and I think that, you view life through a different lens or sort of filter after something like this happens to you, and you don't know what you're going to see differently or what you're going to do differently. You just kind of try and press forward, and now that you're looking at life differently than a lot of other people look at life. At this point, Ariel had lost her wife to alcoholism, her son to a miscarriage, and would soon lose her house to pay for her wife's medical bills and the business. She began corresponding with Dr. John, who split his time between South Africa, where he lived near his divorced wife and his sons, and Mongolia. She found in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood her, who understood in some way that she had lost. At the end of the book, Ariel gets on a plane to South Africa to see him on a visit, and to see what her destiny might hold. Quote, "Until recently, I lived in a world where lost things could always be replaced. But it has been made overwhelmingly clear to me now that anything you think is yours by right can vanish, and what you can do about that is nothing at all. The future I thought I was meticulously crafting for years has disappeared, and with it have gone my ideas about the kind of life I'd imagined was due. As everything else had fallen apart, what has stayed intact is something I always had, the thing that made me a writer: curiosity, hope." End quote. So you have Ariel sort of ending her grieving process and getting to this point where she says, this picturesque or perfect life that I had envisioned for myself is kind of in a rear view mirror now. And what am I going to do moving forward? And sort of almost her bravery of going to see Dr. John and seeing where that relationship could develop. And so you see this acceptance of from her, and this sort of my life's journey and the road now is going to be different, and I can accept that it's going to be different.
Yeah, it's apparent that she emerged kind of pretty changed by pressing forward through the adversity that she, went through in her marriage, and trying to become a parent. And I really felt that this book showed how life is definitely a process, kind of with definitely many chapters. And while there's some value in looking back to learn from situations, like you said, it's kind of looking forward. And I think her contribution of sharing her story, and also this openness to it, she doesn't really say, oh, and here's how the rest of my life is going to go, and here's how I'm going to attack each day and everything, but she just kind of leaves it very open-ended with this like prescription of curiosity and hope. And thought the word curiosity was just leaving that place for discovery and reflection from now on moving forward. And I found it a really great message to end on.
And on that note, that's all we have for today. Thanks for listening and downloading and sharing this experience with us. You can also interact with us and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we announce episodes and share additional information about each podcast. If you have questions or comments about today's podcast, please submit them to us via our website at modernathenas.com, or on our Facebook page under Modern Athenas, our Twitter account at Modern Athenas, or our Instagram at The Modern Athenas Podcast. We would also appreciate if you support our podcast by leaving us a review on iTunes or Stitcher and subscribing to the podcast. In our next podcast, we will be discussing the book Until I Say Goodbye, My Year Living with Joy by Susan Spencer Wendell. As we leave you today, we want to remind you to never forget that each of you, like each of the modern Athenas we have discussed on our podcasts, has the power and capacity to be a change maker in your world. Work hard, dream big, and reach for the stars.